most successful open source projects have a product on top of it. Most successful open source projects have dedicated teams working on it. And those teams are financed. They have salaries, right? Like everybody else in this industry, you work for salary.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 155. The difference between projects and products. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darin and Viktor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darin reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Viktor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darin Pope and Viktor Farsic.
In our previous episode, we were talking about reducing developer friction. And towards the end, I stated something that Viktor corrected me on. And we were talking about when you're treating your platform, producing this thing, treat it as a free market business, not as a monopoly. And a question that we had received on one of our live streams was, well, what's the difference between a project and a product? And I'm going to couch it just a little bit to try to define it. When I'm using the word project, think of it like an open source project, or maybe it's just a skunkworks project that you're doing within your organization versus something that is a product. When you're first starting out with something as an open source project, you might have some lofty goals for it, but there's probably only a couple of people initially working on it. And that's it, right? It's a weekend hack and you're going to open source it, but nothing beyond that. Conversely, a product from day one is meant to generate revenue, usually has a team, whether that team is one person or multiple people, but there's all sorts of extra different roles that have to be in place in order for something to be productized. To simplify, a project is a toy. A product is meant to make sure that I have the ability to buy my own island. So Viktor, what do you think about that?
Did they understand right that what you just explained is basically that product or one kind of product would be the same as project, but with certain features and guarantees in place on top of it?
Correct. That's one way to think of it. Because sometimes a project can turn into a product, and sometimes a product can produce a project, depending on which way you want to look at. Like what you just said there is certain features are only available in the product, but the project, thinking specifically open source, just has a reduced feature set. But the core of it is still pretty much the same. But it's really a thought. And that's what I just said is true, but it's really the process, at least from the beginning, of how do you treat something as a project versus a product. Don't think project as in, okay, this is the project that's going to end up on the Gantt chart so we can go off. That's not the type of project I'm talking about. The mentality I'm trying to sort of set right now is open source project, even though it doesn't have to be open source project. Just, I'm doing this thing. That's how I sort of differentiate the two between project and product. It's a toy. It's not a toy.
Wouldn't necessarily say toy, not a toy. I would rather differentiate it maybe by I'm treating you as a user, meaning that if something doesn't work, I'm responsible for that, instead of redirecting you to, hey, you can open a PR. If you want to use that something, I'm going to give you a good user experience instead of, hey, you can read the code to figure out what that something is, and so on and so forth, right? I'm putting an effort to treat you as, I'm now going to say what I said in the previous episode, as a customer, right? Not necessarily as a contributor. Now, of course, if you look at, let's say, open source projects, of course, not all users are contributors, but very often they're treated as contributors, right? Kind of, hey, this is what I did. I make no guarantees what I'm going to do next. I make no guarantees that this will work. And if it doesn't, and I don't have time to fix it as a contributor, then you can be a contributor. Kind of, it's more like a community, right? Yeah, it is what it is, right? When it's a product, it's not it is what it is. Because if you're not happy, you move to a different one. I'm just trying to establish whether that's the direction you're
that's
looking at.
Absolutely
it, right?
Yeah. In my mind, a project can change over time. In fact, most of them do. Kubernetes in 2022 is not the Kubernetes of 2016, 17. Day one, Google open sourced it, and then Microsoft and Red Hat and everybody else jumped on the bandwagon. But it's still a project. However, people have productized it for themselves, which is fine because of how the licenses allow for that to happen. But as soon as you change something from project to product, just that slight change, people have a different expectation of level of support, level of cost, financial or otherwise. And I believe where things can go wrong is when people have that level of expectation, high levels of expectation on just projects. So if you were to do a matrix of project versus product and expectation on the other axes, a lot of times people have really high expectations of support from a project. And that's an unrealistic expectation. I'm not saying that it's not covered, but you can't expect an open source maintainer, just because you're unhappy that something's green and you want it to be blue, that they're going to make that change for you. Whereas if I'm paying somebody, then I have a higher expectation that it's going to be heard and listened to. I may still get a no on it. I may not like it, but at least I had the semi-guarantee that it was going to be looked at.
And big reason for that is you can walk away from both. You can walk away from a project and you can walk away from a product. And in both cases, both project and product lose a user. But product also loses not only a user, it loses income, right? You're deciding now publicly, and you can tweet about it as well, that you're dissatisfied with Kubernetes, you're not going to use Kubernetes, nothing will happen. Apart from you probably having a long thread in Twitter with a bunch of troll messages over there. But if you do the same thing from, let's say, OpenShift, and I'm using it as an example only, somebody is going to contact you and say, hey, why don't you like us? Why don't want to be our customer anymore? What can we do to convert you from being dissatisfied to being happy? What is missing? Now, I'm not saying in any form of way that when you do that on a project that community is not concerned, why are you unhappy? Kind of like what makes you... But the level of attention and care you would get is very different.
When the exchange of value is money, that's very different than when the exchange of value is congratulations on Twitter. The expectations are very, very different.
Among other reasons, because you're actually financing a person to work on that something, right? Basically, depending on how big the deal is, how big the product, and how big of a customer you are, if you walk away, then actually you're removing 1 or 2 or 10 people from that project. Sorry, from that product, not project.
From that product, right.
Nobody's removed from a project. I mean, eventually, maybe, because if nobody uses a project, then contributions tend to also drop. But if it's a product, when you walk away and stop financing that project, you're essentially removing people from it, people who are working on it. So you can think in a way from of a product. Sorry, did I say project in the previous sentence? I wanted to say product all the time. See, they all start with P. It's complicated, and I forgot what I wanted to say.
I think where you were heading, and maybe not, because I think I forgot what you said too. I think the key part to this is when you decide to leave a product that you've been paying money for, whether that product was based on open source or not. Let's say it's not. Let's say it's Microsoft Windows. Let's say you're a big company, you've been using Microsoft Windows for years, has never been open source. Magic Handwave, never been open source. And he's like, you know what? We're done with that. We're going to move everybody to Mac OS, which means we are all buying Macs. We're getting rid of all of our Dells, we're getting rid of all of our Windows, and going to purely Apple-based products. That's just money. But it's not just money. Those relationships now you have burned with your VARs, because probably Apple and Microsoft could care less about you. Let's just be honest.
Depends
but
who
the
you
CDW, well, it depends on who you are, correct. But in general, if you're a small to medium size, if you're less than 1,000 person company, those two companies are not going to care about you. But the people that you buy your computers from, because you're going through a reseller probably to buy those things. Sort of a bad example going down the hardware route. Let's stick with software for just a moment. So the big differences, again, I'm going to go back to defining the differences between a project and a product, at least in my head. A project is, I'm going to keep using my words because I know you don't like them. I consider a project a toy. It doesn't mean that it is a toy, but it's a toy versus a product, which is not a toy. Because if I've decided as a business owner that something is a product, again, going back to the previous episode, talking about reducing developer friction. If I have decided that I am going to build an internal developer platform, and I'm going to make it reasonably flexible, not forcing people down my way or the highway option. There's some reasonable expectations on both parties. I'm treating it as a product. I'm treating it as my own business. Because if that business fails, I'm out of a job. Or I'm going to go look for another job somewhere else. Whereas if I was treating it as a project within the company, it'd be like, oh, I'm just going to do that in my spare time. Resources are allocated towards products. Resources are not necessarily allocated towards projects.
The problem comes if you do switch back to open source as examples of projects, is that actually the lines are very blurred between what is a project and what is a product. There are obviously differences, just to clarify. But actually, most successful open source projects have a product on top of it. Most successful open source projects have dedicated teams working on it. And those teams are financed. They have salaries, right? Like everybody else in this industry, you work for salary.
But not from the foundation. And that's the difference, is there are commercializers. There's two ways that something that is open source goes commercial. You either have the project that somebody picks up and then commercializes it, so that's going from project to product. Or you have it the other direction. I'll use this HashiCorp's example. They have a product that they have open sourced. And the restrictions on that one, going from product to open source, where they have the rights to open source it, they can be a lot more free. Versus other companies, to where they've built up a commercial offering around an open source project, don't have that same thing because they actually don't own that project. They don't, quote unquote, own it.
Correct. And also, in open source, you speak through numbers, while in a product, you speak through direct business relationship with somebody, right? Nobody cares that you left the project, stopped using a project. If done right, some people do care if 20% of users stopped using a project. And care about first because community is alerted, and kind of, oh, what's wrong? Why are people switching from A to B? But also because if there is a product on top of a project, and very often there is, that project is a funnel to that product. Sometimes, not always, to clarify, right? And if you have, just as losing a customer is a bad thing for a product, losing a funnel for that product is a bad thing. Because the less users are in a project, the smaller that funnel is, the smaller pool of people that are potential customers of the product. The difference is that is valid only in numbers. Nobody cares about you in a project. And in a product, yes, somebody cares about you. Oh, of course, now, example with Windows, you as you don't count because that product is simply, that business is so huge that even in huge businesses, individual doesn't count. But still, even when a product counts on numbers. Those numbers are numbers that raise alerts are smaller than in a project.
So how can we take this project and product mentality and make it not so crazy?
Can you repeat that and make it nicer?
Yeah, I'll try to make it nicer. So I think it's really a confusion point. Some people think it's a project and some people think it's a product. I think the biggest confusion point is people think something is a product when it's actually a project, and then vice versa. They get confused. And it gets back to the definition that I was saying earlier. Products are meant to generate revenue. Projects maybe and maybe not.
So does that mean that actually we have three categories? We have projects, we have products, and we have products on top of projects.
Yeah, we do actually. Project is, how can we do this? Let's say we've got, actually, no, I can't use Kubernetes because it won't work. It falls apart.
Let's say Reveal.js as an example of a project. Yep. I might be wrong, so somebody correct me. That would be a project, right?
Correct.
And we could have Ansible, which is also a project, but sitting below a product. Or Terraform, let's say, right?
Right.
And then we can have a pure product unrelated with any project, like that would be Windows.
Windows, yeah. Or SAP, or any of the other things that...
So the difference is in that funnel, right? For Terraform, Terraform is a funnel for Terraform Cloud, or whatever the product is, right? And Reveal.js is not a funnel for anything.
Because it's just community-based. And
yeah. I mean, Google invested in it, but simply because they're big. They can put 5 people. Who cares? Kind of like about 5 people is small enough, right? But it's not really driving any product that I know of. So there might be hidden reasons over there, but let's imagine that I'm right.
So if I was a company, what would I want to do? In my opinion, I like the HashiCorp model the best. Have an idea, open source it, but I still, quote unquote, own it. I can still have a little bit of control over the open source side. Now, good, bad, or indifferent, that's what the folks at Elastic did. And depending on which side of the fence you want to sit on, some people think it was great, some people think it was horrible. But since they were able to say, okay, at this point, this is the last version that's going to be Apache licensed, and from this point forward, it's going to be a dual license. My open source hat on, I'm screaming, I'm ranting, I'm being a little 2-year-old jumping up and down. As a business person, it makes a lot of sense. I don't have any problems with them doing that because they put a clear line in the sand. Of course, all of that was triggered by AWS and their open source, which is now OpenSearch, and how they forked it. So again, completely fine with it. I don't care about the politics and all the reasons why. You can't chew out a company for doing something that's going to make more money for them. You just can't. You can disagree with it, and that's okay, but you can't fault them because I've got friends working at all these companies, and I want them all to be successful and to not have to go out and look for a job if they like what they're doing. Because if a company is no longer financially viable, then you have to leave, whether you want to or not.
But even in that example of Elastic, there is that edge sword, right? One is, of course, they need to protect their business because they need to pay their employees, which end up being full-time contributors to the project that you're using yourself, if you're not a customer, right? But on the other hand, if people walk away from using Elastic as open source version of Elastic, right, then their business will suffer. So kind of like that, there's that complicated balance of you cannot lose project users and you cannot lose business either because they are so intertwined. They're so dependent on each other. That's why the whole decision about Elastic, right? That's why it was so complicated and controversial. If it would be just Elastic as a product, completely commercial product, then that conversation, that whole debacle would not exist, right?
Would not exist because
nobody would care
because it would be like comparing SAP and PeopleSoft or whatever PeopleSoft turned into, or I can't remember. Again, I'm showing my age right now because PeopleSoft was a thing back however many years ago. But when you had two competing commercial products, who cares? You moved from one to the other, and it didn't matter. You just did that.
Yeah. Nobody's questioning why EC2 is not open source. Or, you're just a user. You're just a customer. You're not the funnel towards becoming a customer.
That is sort of strange, though, isn't it? I guess it's not. Because AWS has never been a project, going back to my earlier definitions. Yes, it started out with EC2 and S3. Those were the first two. Now there's how many thousands of different services with AWS. Now, has AWS done good things for projects? Absolutely. Have they done some things that have been like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Every company has done that.
That's also a curious thing, right? On one hand, I stand behind what I say. Nobody really cares that, or almost nobody cares that EC2, as an example, is Elastic Beanstalk, actually better example, that's completely proprietary, not open and all that stuff. Nobody's questioning that. But on the other hand, I can attribute huge adoption of EKS because Kubernetes is open source.
Correct.
Right? Now, I don't know whether that's a main motive driver towards adoption of EKS now or no. I cannot speak in numbers, but some percentage of EKS usage must be attributed to, compared to, I don't know, ECS, let's say, or Elastic Beanstalk or whatever, must be attributed to it being open source, which is confusing. I'm confusing myself, right? I just said that nobody cares that Elastic Beanstalk is just a product, completely closed product. And then next sentence I say, hey, actually, the skyrocket usage of EKS is attributed to being based on open source.
Well, it's true, though. I believe that's true because think back before EKS existed. If we wanted to run Kubernetes on AWS, what did we do?
Use kops.
Notice how you said that. You knew exactly what, you didn't use kubeadm, you used kops. KOPS for anybody uninitiated. By the way, if you're creating Kubernetes clusters on AWS using kops today, you need to rethink your life decisions.
Unless you're doing it because you're a contributor to kops. One of the 5.
Yeah. And that's a great example of a project that was gangbusters until a commercial offering from the platform, and we've used platform probably in a lot of different bad ways here, but since AWS moved over to EKS or provided EKS as a service. I think it's true. I think EKS, if Kubernetes did not exist, EKS would not exist, right? It just wouldn't, right? If Google would have never open sourced Kubernetes, and basically saying if Borg had never come to light through Kubernetes, I mean, Kubernetes isn't Borg, Borg isn't Kubernetes, but they're very similar. AWS would still have Elastic Beanstalk and the variations of that. Assuming Docker even came out, we would have ECS, but we wouldn't have EKS. On Azure, we would probably have ACI, but we would not have AKS. Now, Kubernetes is just Kubernetes, right? It's going to be not the only one, but it's going to be one of a handful of things that have that kind of shift.
And it's very likely that in that scenario, ECS usage today would be more or less as big as ECS plus EKS usage is combined, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because kind of people need such a thing. And they would happily use, all AWS users would happily use ECS. And wouldn't really complain about ECS being proprietary fully, not based on anything we know and stuff like that, right? So people don't care about it being open source until they get open source alternative to something which later is productivized and becomes a product. So what I'm trying to say is that people clearly prefer products based on open source than just products when given a choice.
I'm going to mostly agree with you on that. And that's assuming that you've got an organization that is open to using open source.
No, I'm still saying products.
I know you're saying products, but the way I heard you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the way I heard you was if a company is more open to using something that's productized if it was open source. Did I misunderstand that?
Yes.
Okay, so that is what you said.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, product alone has less chance of succeeding than product based on open source.
Open source. Okay, I do agree with that. The only time that that's not true goes back to the SAPs of the world. In other words, things that have been out there that for that long, to where there was no good open source back then, and there still has never been a good open source since that point. Or trying to displace Windows, right? This is the year of the Linux desktop, says everybody every year, and it will never happen.
Here's the thing. There was never and people are going to start throw stones at me for what I'm about to say. There was never a dominant Linux-based desktop product. If I'm faced now with a bunch of Linux-type desktop products, and I cannot even go to wherever you buy your laptops and get it, then it's not a real product. So it's not a desktop. How do I go to Best Buy and buy? Can I go to Best Buy and get more than one laptop to choose from that has desktop Linux product? Can I do that?
Not from Best Buy, no, but from Dell, yes.
Yeah, and Dell happens to be one of the two in total, and I'm not even sure whether you can buy it in any store. You can order it online, and so it's not that you cannot do it, but it's not serious. It's not a serious product, right? It's Dell, one of many that even Dell is not pushing really that above their Windows offering. Dell itself sells Windows first, and then Linux desktop second. So if it's not serious for a vendor, why would it be serious for me? And I'm not against Linux, just to clarify. I think it's great. I would buy Dell. What do they package? Ubuntu or something like that, rather than Windows myself. But it's for masses. It's not a serious thing yet. Probably never will be.
Is that sad? Should it be? Okay, so let's ask this. Going all this whole project. So if they've had an Ubuntu desktop, and I think you're right, I think that's the distribution. What would happen if, and we've got these, basically it boils down to two, in my opinion. It's either going to be a Fedora-based or it's going to be a Debian-based, right? It's going to be one of those two if a Linux desktop is going to come around. And if nobody has been able to successfully commercialize that yet, what makes us think that that's even going to be possible in the future?
I don't think it will be. I don't think that we will see
But why? The reason why is we have Windows and we have Mac OS. Thinking desktop only for the moment.
Because we have two serious players in that space, which you just named them, right? Microsoft and Apple. We never had a serious player in Linux desktop space. And it sounds offensive as if Canonical is not serious. They are, but not really to the level that they can play and compete with the other two.
And if I'm just needing something lightweight, I'm not, and I've got underpowered hardware, like I still have some old MacBook Airs, I am probably not going to pick a Linux distribution for a desktop. I am going to pick Google Chrome Flex.
Exactly. And here it is. Here's the question. Why? And the reason why you're going to pick, what did you just say, Android, right? No, not Android.
Well, Flex. Yeah, or is it Flex or whatever it's called?
Yeah. Because it solves a different problem. It takes a different approach. If we exclude developers, realistically, what is the reason why would my mom get Linux desktop?
Web browsing, email access.
Yeah, I mean,
that's it.
Why is that better than her getting Windows that is in every single store in the world, or Mac? No, right? Now, if you talk about Android on laptops, then hey, actually, this is serving different audience. This is extremely good, extremely efficient for low-powered hardware, right? I can buy a laptop for $200 for my daughter for school, right? So there is a Google found market segment that is not necessarily well served with others. Linux never managed to do that on desktops, laptops, consumer electronics.
Yeah, I misspoke. It's Chrome OS, not Google.
Yeah, Chrome OS, not Android.
Chrome OS.
Yes, Chrome OS. Yeah, there it is. Chrome OS, right. So Chrome OS succeeded in a way where Linux failed. But that's because it has Google behind it, and it figured out, hey, I'm not actually competing with Windows, or at least I'm figuring out which market segment of Windows I'm really competing with, right? Which is cheap devices, right?
And it's not, and I like how you just said that. It wasn't that they were competing in education, they were competing on cheap devices, which may be used in education, it may be used in lower economies, and to have something that is efficient on lower cost devices, Microsoft isn't going to optimize for that. Apple definitely isn't going to optimize for that. The chances of any of the Linux desktop providers, they're not going to optimize for that because they're going after enterprise. They're looking for money. So the only real competitors to Chrome OS are going to be who knows what. But they're not going to have the funding to pull it off like Google does.
You just said actually the keyword, enterprises, right? Linux did actually what we just spoke about, right? It's just that Linux found its market. It's just that market happened not to be your laptop. That's servers. Servers run Linux. We can actually argue that maybe, for all I know, there might be more devices, more computers running Linux, and most likely there are more computers running Linux than Windows or macOS. It's just that just as schools and low economies are the market segment for Chrome OS, servers are market segment for Linux. Doesn't have to be a desktop, and it's not.
And doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
As I'm sitting here staring at some Raspberry Pis, I run them. I've got one Raspberry Pi that I actually have the desktop running on, but most of them I run headless.
Exactly.
And let me tell you, the desktop experience on a Raspberry Pi is fine, but it's just that. It's just fine.
And it's just fine for you, not for my mom, right?
I don't know that'd be good for your mom, but maybe, right? I mean, it could be dressed up and be, but it's just fine. Whereas if I was to compare the Raspberry Pi desktop UI against Chrome OS, I'm going to take Chrome OS every day of the week. It's a much better user experience. How do we end up here? We're talking about project versus product.
I was about to ask you the same. I have no idea how we ended up
here. We pivoted somewhere and I lost track. So anyway.
How often do we finish an episode on the subject?
Rarely. So anyway, that was our attempt at trying to explain the differences between projects and products. What do you think? Go over into the Slack workspace, check out the podcast channel, and leave your comments there.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.